Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. My name is Casey Lewis, and I'm a product marketing manager at Streetlight. Before we get started, I wanted to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded. We'll send out a link to the recording and the webinar slides in about 24 hours. If you have any questions during the webinar, please ask us using the Q&A feature. You should see this module on the right-hand side control panel. Just type in your question and we'll answer it at the end of the presentation. We kindly ask that you don't ask questions as anonymous so that we can follow up with you after the presentation if we don't get to your question. As mentioned, my name is Casey and I'm a product marketing manager at Streetlight. Joining us today are Emily Adler. She is a director of content at Streetlight. Previously, she served as editorial director covering investment trends at CB Insights and is a founding editor at Business Insider's subscription research service, BI Intelligence. Erin O'Higgins is a solutions engineer at Streetlight. She previously worked as a transportation engineer specializing in road safety and active transportation design. And Alice Friedman is a product manager for active and transit modes at Streetlight. She has over a decade of expertise in active transportation in both government and the tech sectors. She previously served as deputy director of the bicycle program at the NYC Department of Transportation and currently leads data science-driven product development at Streetlight. Thank you to everybody who's participating today. Today, we are continuing our active transportation webinar series, building off of our US Bike Trends webinar earlier this fall. Here is the agenda for today. I will share an overview of Streetlight and our active transportation solutions. Then Emily will share insights from the US Pedestrian Mode Share Trends Report and rankings of metro areas across the country. Then Erin will show a demo of a new Streetlight product, our soon to be released active transportation monitor that powers the active transportation trend reports we're sharing. And finally, we'll finish with a Q&A. First, I will go over Streetlight. New technology and new behaviors have raised the bar on how we measure transportation. Everything that moves these days is generating data. By leveraging connected devices and IoT data, we are able to understand mobility and measure how vehicles, bikes, and pedestrians move. Streetlight pioneered the use of big data analytics to shed light on how people, goods, and services move around, empowering smarter, data-driven transportation decisions. Streetlight's proprietary data processing engine, Root Science, transforms trillions of mobility data points over time into standard transportation metrics for vehicular, transit, bicycling, and pedestrian travel, available on demand 24/7 via our interactive platform, Streetlight Insight. Within Streetlight Insight, in just a few clicks, you can pull analytics about nearly any transportation behavior, anywhere, for any mode. You can understand origin and destination travel patterns within your region. You can collect vehicle counts or bike counts on your road segments and see how it changes throughout a typical day or seasonally throughout the year. Or you can visualize the most congested routes between regional activity centers and a downtown business district. We'll cover some of these metrics in more detail during our presentation today. But it's not simply about the data itself. Rather, Streetlight distills massive amounts of transportation data into actionable insights so that you can make informed decisions about where to invest in your transportation system. Today, we are focusing on walking and broader active transportation mode share. As Emily will cover in the report later, we are noticing an uptick in pedestrian fatalities across the country and safety concerns that make it difficult to encourage walking. However, as we know, there are programs in place that many of you are tackling to address this crisis, such as Vision Zero, Safe Streets and Roads for All. Using a data-driven approach will ensure safety interventions are implemented in the most effective locations to ensure safer, healthier, and greener communities. Within Streetlight's active transportation solutions, you can measure validated active transportation activity on demand in a few clicks. Leverage ready-made visualizations of empirical, validated active transportation activity over time to demonstrate the impact of past projects and garner stakeholder and public buy-in for future plans. You can secure funding for new programs, federal or local, and know where best to deploy it. You can scan bicycle and pedestrian travel across your region to identify the highest value locations for infrastructure improvements and policy implementation, especially to improve safety and public health. Today, you will see a demo of our active transportation monitor, which will show how you can track the activity mix of cycling and walking in comparison to vehicle travel over time to evaluate the impact of policies targeting mode shift behavior. Now, I would like to pass it off to Emily to share insights from our US pedestrian and mode share trends.
Hi, all. I'm Emily Adler. I'm the Director of Content here at Streetlight, as Casey noted. So today we're going to talk about some of our most important and I'd say eye-popping findings from our recent Walking and Mode Share Trends report, which we developed using our soon-to-be-released active transportation monitor, which Erin will demo at the end. So I think what's really critical to understand about this data is that we're not just talking about walking activity in isolation. Understanding how one mode rises and falls in isolation can be a somewhat limiting benchmark because you might just assume, well, if walking went up, so did biking and so did vehicle trips, everyone just must be moving around more. But I think seeing walking in context of mode share, which looks at walking, biking, and vehicle trips, we can see the impact of infrastructure and policy much more holistically and get a better handle on whether we're achieving goals around mode shift, which many communities have started focusing on. So with that in mind, so that's sort of the mode share piece of this in addition to pedestrian. And so with that in mind, I'm going to back up for a second. And before I talk about walking activity, I'm just going to talk about some top line data from our biking report, which we released about a month ago. So here, the news is quite positive. We had a huge national spike in biking activity, and that was felt in nearly every metro and state. One metro, New York, almost doubled average daily biking activity, which is our metric. And many saw biking activity rise by around 50% or more during the 3-year period from 2019 to 2022. The data answered a big question we had, which was, did we sustain this biking boom that we heard about early in the pandemic that got so many headlines? And the data was unequivocal. Yes, we did. It was not just a pandemic blip. The trend line does start to flatline in 2022 and even fall a tiny bit in certain places, but overall the enthusiasm, the demand for biking very much stays high. Okay, so now walking. Biking gets a lot of headlines, but and maybe it's a little bit more exciting than walking, but walking is actually a much more prevalent form of transportation. And by that, I mean just far more people walk. It just accounts for a larger share of trips, and thus is much more impactful on the transportation ecosystem as a whole. And so here we see just how different the stories between the two modes really is, how much they're diverging. So you can see in this line chart that annual daily average walking trips took a pretty big decline over the 3-year period. They're down by 36% between 2019 to 2022. Also, notably, I want to call out that the biggest drop was actually in 2021, not 2020, as we might expect with the initial pandemic behavior shift. So this looks like more of a sustained decline to me, kind of like a settling in. But as we'll see, 2022 in certain metros, we start to see some changes there and some increases coming back. So why is walking activity so important? Well, it has obvious public health benefits. It's exercise. In addition to public health, walking tends to be more common among lower income individuals who don't necessarily have access to a car. So if there's less walking, it might be among those who have more choices in terms of transportation mode, and that could lead to a cycle of disinvestment. So, some concerns there about potential furthering of inequities. And then perhaps, most obviously, as we talk about walking and mode shift together, walking is critical to achieving climate goals. So more people engaged in active transportation instead of vehicle trips, again, that mode shift, mode share angle, that means fewer greenhouse gas emissions. And we know transportation is the biggest contributor to climate emissions. So in addition to electrification, active transportation modes have a big impact on whether we're moving in the right direction on bringing down emissions. The other important thing to note here, which Casey mentioned earlier, is safety. So I'm sure a lot of folks on this call know pedestrian safety has been a major concern in the past few years as pedestrian fatalities have risen. So seeing this data sort of with that in the backdrop is notable. There are fewer pedestrians on the road, there are fewer trips happening, but fatalities are rising. So I think this really amplifies how important prioritizing safety for vulnerable road users is. Things like traffic calming measures, bringing down speeds, complete streets programs, new intersection interventions. And these interventions, can potentially work in tandem. If you make communities more safely walkable, you potentially bring down fatalities and pull walking activity back up. So that is the broad national picture. And now we've got a poll on question on your right before I go into kind of the metro-wide data. We're asking about your own interest in walking and mode share initiatives, and why is this something you're focused on? Since it intersects with a lot of themes we've talked about: safety, equity, climate, even economic. So if you could go ahead and answer that, and we can see how your priorities align with your peers on the webinar. Okay, so now I'm going to go into this the map with metro data. We've seen these top line numbers showing this big decline in walking activity, and how that's different from what happened with biking. Another important distinction I want to make in what we saw with biking versus walking is, for biking, the differences geographically were quite were quite pronounced. So the spread of change in walking activity over the 3-year period, it was like 110 percentage points. So really different between what's happening in New York versus what's happening in Portland or what's happening in Dallas. Like, you know, in terms of just the overall growth numbers. In the case of walking, the differences are a lot narrower, but the decline is universal, but the differences are quite a bit narrower. So every metro we looked at saw a decline in walking activity between 2019 through 2022. Those declines ranged from 23% to 49%, and this is among the 100 biggest metros by population. So again, coming back to that percentage difference, the range just wasn't nearly as wide as biking, excuse me. And I will say that when I first saw this data, it's a little bit shocking, because I don't think we think about it. We talk about remote work all the time, and how that's impacted downtowns and how that's the economic impacts. But I don't think we talk as much about how it affects our overall like day-to-day lived experience of walking around. And of course, here we're just looking at the data of what happened. But I think when I think about the remote work trend, that feels like a really strong correlation to me. By not going into the office as frequently, you're cutting down on walking trips to transit, walking trips from a vehicle into the office, walking trips to get lunch during a lunch break, all that kind of stuff, especially if people are working remotely, working remotely from where they live, and those places where they live are not designed for walkability. So I think as we think about, our own, some of our own lives and this new normal, we can begin to see how walking activity has changed pretty dramatically. And if Casey, could you back up once? Thank you. If you look at the most populated metros on the map, you begin to see some geographic distinctions, though they're not super pronounced. Some of the smallest declines are concentrated in warmer weather locations, especially in Florida and a couple in the Southwest. So we'll see this theme of warm weather locations faring best for walking activity crop up throughout the data. Okay, so now on the next slide, we can see the cities ranked from smallest to largest decline over the 3-year period. So again, warmer cities, metros faring best. Sarasota ranks best in terms of it only saw a 23% decline in walking activity, which is the strongest performance of any of the metros. Overall, 9 out of the 10 metros that saw the smallest declines were in warm weather locations, places like Phoenix, Las Vegas, San Diego. New York and LA, the 2 biggest metros in the country, each saw about a 30% decline in walking trips. And then on the flip side, so this is the bottom 50 metros ordered by change in walking trips since 2019. So the biggest decline in metro walking activity was in Akron, Ohio at nearly 50%. And a number of the other cities with big declines were located in the Midwest. And then Houston, Dallas, Atlanta, and DC, those are 4 cities with over 5 million people that saw over a 40% decline in walking. Okay, so that is the sort of the 3-year big picture. But we wanted to understand what's happened most recently. Are we starting to see a change in these trends? Is the news shifting a little bit? So there is, as we look at 2022, if you could move to the next slide. Oh, you're on it. Okay. So the national figures show a small decline in walking in 2022. But in a number of specific metros, we are starting to see walking activity come back. LA, again, one of the biggest metros in the country, actually leads the recovery with a 19% increase in 2022. And again, going back to that theme of warmer weather places faring better, 9 out of the 10 top increases in walking activity in 2022 are based in California. In 10th place is New York with a 7% increase. So I want to step back and talk about this warm weather trend a bit and why I think it's important. So, I talked a little bit about this thesis that remote work may be playing a really big role in this change that we're seeing. And I think this warm weather trend sort of supports that idea and suggests that as many work from less walkable locations, and walking to work is less common, or going to work is less common. And so that's tamping down walking. Walking becomes less a mode of utility and more a mode of recreation. And so that could help explain why it's coming back more strongly in warm weather locations. And of course, recreation is great. It's great for public health goals. But as we think about things like climate and equity, I think we want to see walking become more universal for utility as well as recreation. So here's where I think our mode share data is really critical, because we could say, well, I think if we didn't have mode share, we could say, well, people are walking less because they're working from home more, but maybe that also means they're driving less. They're just not going out as much. And that's not great, but it doesn't necessarily mean, we're sort of mode shift is going in the wrong direction necessarily. But our mode shift share data shows that in fact, vehicle trips are only slightly below where they were in 2019. I believe they're about 4% below in 2022 where they were in 2019. So they've bounced back significantly. So people may not be walking as much, but they are finding reasons to drive around. And if you think about people in their homes, they're potentially located in less walkable locations where you need a car to get around during the day, even if you're not going into the office. So you can see what this looks like in the share chart. Active transportation, which combines bicycle and pedestrian trips, has declined from 14% to 10% in 2022. You can also see just how thin that biking slice is. So the biking is the light yellow and walking is the brighter yellow. And so even though biking has gone up quite a bit, it's still not offsetting that decline in walking. And that also translates at the metro level. We saw a decline in active transportation share of trips in all the metros. However, here there is a lot more sensitivity at the individual metros to the change by trip type, bicycling, walking, or vehicle. So we ranked our metros and looking at where they ranked compared to their peers for active transportation share of trips in 2019 through 2022. And so you can see that our top three metros didn't change at all between 2019 and 2022. While all three saw a decline in walking and biking's combined share of trips, it didn't change how they compared to their peers. But there are some nuances further on. So Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, for example, actually saw their ranking go up in active transportation share. And I think that's interesting because Portland actually saw a decline in both walking and biking trips over the 3-year periods. So how did share improve relative to peers? Fewer vehicle trips. Seattle and Sacramento also improved in rank due to fewer vehicle trips. And fewer vehicle trips could be a function of a lot of different factors, such as population change, transit access, safety. I think here is where some of the stuff Erin will talk about in a bit, digging into localized data can be really powerful for agencies and advocates trying to diagnose root causes, measure impact, and really isolate what's going on at the local level. Notably, the metros that saw some of the biggest declines in ranking for active transportation share of trips included Indianapolis, Akron, which is where we saw the biggest walking decline, and Louisville. Finally, on this last slide, we've got a look at the top 25 biggest metros by population. So this is a waterfall chart that shows that little line at the top is where we were in terms of active transportation's share of trips in 2019. And then the arrow pointing down is where we landed in 2022. And so you can see that New York is still sort of in a class of its own as far as active transportation's share of trips, even though it's declined just like the rest. We can also see overall that Sacramento saw one of the smallest declines. But in general, the range of percentage declines, given how many trips we're talking about, is fairly narrow. So even though this data largely looks to be moving kind of not necessarily in the direction we might want it to be, no single metro or state seems to be seeing a level of decline that's totally irreversible. The numbers from 2022 suggest that a rebound is still possible, though it looks like it'll take significant investment across a variety of areas, including safety, road design, transit access, land use. And I think this is especially true in more suburban regions where density and walkability is less common, but where people are increasingly spending their weekday time. So definitely download the report for more detailed findings. We cover per capita data, and we also look at these trends at the statewide level. But also lots more to unpack here at the local level for agencies. So I'm going to turn it over to Erin now, who will talk about how clients can use their active transportation monitor to better understand these trends in their regions.
Thank you, Emily. These pedestrian trends are really interesting, and it really does highlight the need to prioritize building safe infrastructure for pedestrians. So next, I'm going to show you two in-app demonstrations of our active transportation monitor, which is launching in Streetlight's Insight platform later this month. The active transportation monitor is really straightforward to set up, and it runs within seconds. Using our active transportation monitor, you can quickly you can evaluate change in cycling or walking activity over time between 2019 and 2022. And you can quickly scan mode share over time for your region of interest. Our platform makes all of this data really easy to visualize and to share across your organization. So I'll open up the app now and get to our first example, which is in Orlando, Florida. Great. So the active transportation monitor can be run at a statewide level or for a whole county or for specific census tracts of interest. So I ran this analysis for Orange County, Florida, which includes Orlando. And you can choose to visualize bike volumes instead of pedestrian volumes or bike trends. But as many of you were on our bike trends webinar just last month, I'll focus on a pedestrian example today. So right now we're looking at a dot density map representing the average annual daily volume of pedestrian trips happening in Orange County, Florida over the span of 2019 to 2022. The dot density corresponds to the volume of trips happening in each census tract. So as I move my mouse over the individual census tracts, you can see the yearly volume metrics for each one. And there are some census tracts with visibly much more pedestrian activity than others. So in the bottom left here, there's a lot of pedestrian activity, and this is where Disney World is. And to the right up here, even denser pedestrian activity, and this is Universal Studios. So it's not surprising that there's lots of pedestrian trips happening at the amusement parks. Right now we have all 4 years selected, all 4 years of data. So we're visualizing the average annual daily volume of pedestrian trips for the whole 4 years. And you have the option to narrow down your years of interest and get data for your selected time period. The pedestrian activity trend percentage, which Emily talked lots about, is measuring the region-wide percent volume change between the first and last year you have selected. So right now we're looking at the change between 2019 and 2022. And again, if you narrow down your years of interest, you can narrow down what you're looking at. So right now it's telling us that between 2019 and 2022, the volume of pedestrian trips in Orange County dropped by nearly 26%. And as Emily mentioned, this is on the lower end of the percentage change when comparing it to cities across the country. This is a warm weather city, so that probably has an impact, and maybe the amusement parks are also contributing to this as well. And if I select different years, we can see how that trend evolved year over year. So we'll start by selecting 2019 and 2020 to see the trend over the first year of the pandemic. So it looks like there was a 20% drop in pedestrian activity in that first year of the pandemic. And the following year, between 2020 and 2021, we see an additional 13% decrease. And if I select 2021 and 2022, you can see that the volume of pedestrian trips in Orange County, Florida is actually trending upwards in 2022, which is definitely encouraging. And if you want to visualize this percent change or this trend, you can, under the drop-down menu here, you can select volume percent change, and you can get a visualization of how that percent change is distributed throughout the county. The other options for visualizing under the drop-down menu are you can visualize the volume of trips per person in each census tract, as well as per square mile. And lastly, you can visualize the pedestrian mode share. I'll select all 4 years again to look at that. So pedestrian mode share gives us the percentage of total number of trips in our region of interest that are pedestrian trips. So in this calculation, the total trips include all vehicle trips, bike trips, and pedestrian trips. And we're looking at the percentage of total trips, that pedestrian trips make up. And again, you can do this or you can choose to visualize bike trips instead, if that's what you're looking for. So I will note that this total trip number doesn't include transit trips, but that's something that you can add into these metrics with your local transit ridership data. So in Orange County, Florida, pedestrian trips made up nearly 16% of all trips between 2019 and 2022. And this might seem quite high at first, but it includes all pedestrian trips. So for example, a commuter who takes transit would probably have multiple walking trips as part of their commute, both to and from work. Somebody who drives may have to walk from their car if they can't park right at the office. And in the case of the amusement parks, we're looking at walking trips probably between most rides. So the minimum distance for a pedestrian trip to be included is 250 meters. And the darker yellow here means that the pedestrian trips make up a higher percentage of the total trips in that census tract. So of course, we're seeing high pedestrian mode share percentages in the amusement parks with at Disney World, 45% of the trips are pedestrian trips. So that makes sense. And earlier when we were visualizing the just the total pedestrian trip volumes, we saw that pedestrian activity in Orange County, Florida had decreased by 26% between 2019 and 2022. And we can see here that the pedestrian mode share percentage only decreased by 21%. So that reflects the fewer number of total trips being taken. But as Emily mentioned earlier, that only accounts for a small portion of that decrease in pedestrian trips. So I'm going to show you one more example in LA County, California. So we're looking at that same dot density map representing average annual pedestrian trip volumes for each census tract in LA County. And based on the dot density map, we can see the highest density of pedestrian trips or where the highest density of pedestrian trips are taking place, with lots of trips happening in downtown LA and in Santa Monica and in Hollywood. So the pedestrian activity trend tells us that there's been a 35% decrease in ped activity between 2019 and 2022 in LA. Emily presented this figure before, and it aligns more closely with the national trends. And if we take a closer look at these year-over-year trends, starting again with the first 2 years here, 2019 and 2020, you can see that there was a 31% drop in pedestrian activity in that first year of the pandemic alone. And in 2020 to 2021, we can see another drop, another 19% drop in the second year. And looking at 2021 to 2022, as Emily mentioned in her presentation, we're seeing that volume of ped trips begin to rise back up, climbing by 19%. So it's definitely encouraging to see a bit of recovery in one of the most densely populated US cities. And hopefully we see that trend reflected in other cities in the 2023 metrics when they come out. So looking at these year-over-year trends in your region provides you with really insightful data on traveler behavior. Investing in safe pedestrian facilities is particularly important right now, and the Active Transportation Monitor can help you identify at a high level where network improvements are needed and where funding needs to be allocated. So the Active Transportation Monitor can also be a great tool for before and after studies, because not only can you measure how big of an impact active transportation network improvements have locally, but you can also see the big picture and identify how local investments affect area-wide trends in active transportation. So that's it for my in-app demonstration, and I'll hand it back over to Casey, who I think will be welcoming questions.
Thank you, Erin, for that demonstration. It's exciting to see how the Active Transportation Monitor can be used in regions across the country. So now, before we head into answering your questions in the Q&A, we wanted to thank you for your attendance today. If you are interested in a consultative discovery call with one of our representatives to uncover how we can support your active transportation specific initiatives, click the Yes, Let's Chat Soon button in the poll on your screen. And now we will move on over to the Q&A component. Feel free to continue to ask any questions about the content that you've seen today. But we have some questions that have already come rolling in while we were presenting that we will answer now. So as mentioned, we have one of our product managers for active and active modes on the call today, Alice Friedman. So I will pass off some of these questions specific to like how we define some of the things in our sample now. So Alice, how do we define a walk or biking trip for the Active Transportation Monitor, and what is included in those?
Hi. So a walk trip is aligned. We have the definition aligned with the National Household Travel Survey definition. So it's any trip that is longer than 250 meters. And we use our mode classifier algorithm to understand from the data sort of like what's a walk trip, what's a bike trip. So it's going to incorporate number of different things. There isn't really one strict definition I can give you, but it's going to be things that move a certain way. They have, they're on a bike lane. It's going to help classify it as a bike versus it's, slower or it's shorter. If it's on a limited access highway, for example, that's going to take it away from being a walk trip. But any bicycle-like vehicle, so that might include like a skateboard or a scooter, e-bike, all that will be included in the bike measures.
Thank you, Alice. And how do we validate our active transportation monitor results?
So our active transportation monitor is validated using a methodology developed by the CDC. And basically what we do is we look at the rank order agreement with information from the American Community Surveys, ACS, and looking at a couple of different years. So we do have very good agreement, and we actually exceeded what was published by the CDC in their paper in our recent data delivery.
Great, thank you. For more information on data sources and methodology in general at Streetlight, we have a variety of white papers available on our website for like our fundamental Streetlight data sources and methodology. And when the active transportation monitor is released in a few weeks, we will have an accompanying white paper for that as well. One other question that came up, a couple of questions have come up about like evaluating the impact of specific bike and pedestrian infrastructure projects or looking at specific road segments and intersections. And so I will let Alice share kind of like what other resources we have at Streetlight and products we offer that can support those questions.
Yeah, so we get this question a lot. And so with Active Transportation Monitor, the data is available at the census tract and larger only. So you can't necessarily look with this data set at a particular section, a particular segment. But what you can do is answer sort of the larger question of, well, did this really have an impact on mode share in our neighborhood or in our region? Looking at not only were there more trips or fewer trips on the specific roadway where a project might have been implemented, but also looking at, did that actually bring in more trips from nearby roads? So for very specific segment level bicycle and pedestrian volume, we do have our bicycle and pedestrian volume model product, which is the older version that's available in app today. But we do really recommend taking a look at Active Transportation Monitor as a before and after methodology, because it can sort of answer that broader question in a really sort of new and interesting way.
Great, thank you. And then as mentioned, methodology and more information for those bicycle and pedestrian volume products for our historical metrics are also available on the Streetlight website if you're curious to learn more. A number of other questions came in about specific areas and drivers of some of the data that we saw in the report, such as like are decreases in walking trips concentrated in CBDs, are the decreases more widespread, and then some things about like demographic changes. So questions like that, in our report, we cover some of that in more detail, and there's a little bit more there's some more anecdotal data, more context for different states and regions that we were able to cover today. But also this is where we encourage you to kind of dig into the analysis yourself, zoom in on your areas, zoom in on your regions, look at kind of the specific census tracts and counties that encompass your CBDs and surrounding regions, look at suburbs versus central business districts. And then also with like using your other data sources to kind of add color about what's going on in your region and what you understand about population change, policy, to add that color, because obviously we're looking at a national level and we're digging into some CBDs, but there's so much more that knowing what's going on in your specific cities, regions, MPOs, will be able to add more of that color. And then I'm trying to see if there is anything else right now. Oh, Alice, we had some questions about kind of how the mode share metrics are calculated.
So the mode share is the mode out of the total of vehicle plus pedestrian plus bike. So it doesn't include transit in locations where transit is a factor. It is number of trips, so it's trip starts and ends. So if you have your own transit data, you can add that in to get the fuller picture. But in general, the mode share percentage is going to be the percent of the mode you select out of the mode plus bike or ped plus vehicle trips in a census tract.
Great. And then finally, we have a question about granularity of data periods for active transportation monitor. How granular can you get? And then, yeah.
So this data is available at the annualized level. So it's an average annual daily trip is the metric. And it's available in data periods 2019 through 2022. And we're looking to add 2023 sometime next year.
Yeah. And then, as mentioned, with some of our historical bicycle and pedestrian data, there may be more granular data periods available, but they are representing a further back time period if you are looking at daily or monthly averages, monthly averages. All right. I think that is kind of all the time that we have left. I wanted to mention that we have another webinar coming up in our webinar series. This one will focus on GHG emissions and climate implications in the transportation sector. So register today if you're interested in that. I wanted to say thank you to all of you. And as a reminder, we will be sending the webinar content within a couple of days. And we'll follow up with you if you were interested in getting more information and if you have questions. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.